The message came quietly at first, a faint whisper traveling through the darkness of space. It was not meant for anyone in particular, but it reached the wrong people, or maybe the right ones. A small satellite orbiting a human outpost on the edge of known space caught it, a desperate cry that repeated again and again. The transmission was weak, broken by static, but one thing was clear. It was an SOS. The signal came from a planet named Karun, a place no one had ever heard of. Its voice was full of panic and pain. Whoever was sending it was begging for help. The message reached the Deathworlder Coalition Command within hours. Inside a giant war room floating above Titan, the home base of the fleet, officers listened in silence. The sound of a dying world filled the speakers, a voice cracking with fear, talking about invaders, about cities burning, about skies dark with fire. No one could even identify the species of the speaker. It was a strange language, full of clicks and pulses, but translation software gave it a meaning clear enough. "We are under attack. Please help us, anyone." It was not a call for alliance or trade. It was a scream for survival. For a long time, the humans and their Deathworlder allies just stared at each other. The Deathworlders were not a single race. They were a coalition of the toughest, most dangerous species in the galaxy, beings who had grown up on violent worlds, who understood war better than peace. They had come together not out of love, but out of respect. They knew what it meant to fight for life when no one else would come to help. And now, somewhere far beyond their borders, someone was going through the same thing. The commander of the fleet, Admiral Cale Dern, was a human who had seen too many battles. His face was scarred and his eyes were cold with experience. When he heard the transmission, he didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "Who else received this signal?" An officer answered, "No one, sir. It's too far beyond regular traffic channels." The admiral nodded slowly. "Then if we don't go, no one will." That simple sentence changed everything. There were doubts, of course. The council argued that it could be a trap, or maybe a false alarm. Some said that sending the fleet so far for an unknown species would be suicide. But the Deathworlders had never been the kind to sit still while others suffered. The decision came down to one principle they all shared. No cry for help goes unanswered. They didn't call it mercy. They called it duty. On Deathworlds, mercy was a luxury few could afford, but duty was sacred. Soon the order was given. Every ship in the coalition was to prepare for movement. The message spread across colonies, and in every hangar and every barracks, people began to move with purpose. Mechanics reactivated engines that had slept for years. Engineers tested shields. Soldiers checked weapons, and communication officers calculated the jump coordinates from the signal's origin. It would be a long, dangerous journey, through regions of space no one had mapped. But that only made it more important. The Deathworlders had built their reputation on doing what others would not. Across the fleet, the mood was strange. Part excitement, part fear. For some, it was another mission. For others, it was a chance to prove that even the roughest worlds could still hold compassion. The humans remembered Earth's early days when they too had been fragile and alone. The other races, the Garun, the Veshek, the O'Leary, each had their own memories of being ignored, of being abandoned when their worlds burned. That shared pain bound them together more tightly than any treaty could. Admiral Cale Dern walked the main deck of the flagship Eternal Resolve. The ship was ancient, one of the first carriers built after the Great War. Its hull was marked by hundreds of scars from old battles. He ran his hand over one of them and thought about what they were about to do. "We don't even know who they are," said his second-in-command, a tall Garun officer with silver skin and deep black eyes. The admiral replied quietly, "We don't need to. Someone out there is dying. That's enough." Meanwhile, across the stars, the planet Karun was falling apart. The skies were thick with smoke and dust. The Karunians, small, delicate creatures with transparent skin and glowing veins, ran through streets that no longer looked like streets. Their cities, once shining with towers of glass, had become traps of fire. The invaders, a swarm of machines feeding on organic matter, covered the land like a plague. Every time the survivors tried to call for help, their voices vanished into static. Until finally, by some miracle, one message broke through. Back on Titan Station, the fleet continued to ready itself. Ships from 10 different worlds gathered one by one, filling the dark space around the dock with light. The Iron Spire, a Veshek destroyer, arrived with its engines burning blue. The Howling Dawn, a human battleship known for surviving impossible odds, joined the formation. Smaller craft, supply vessels, medships, all fell into place like pieces of an ancient ritual. The fleet wasn't just moving, it was awakening. The engineers said it would take 3 days to prepare for the jump. Those 3 days felt like forever. Soldiers sharpened their blades, fixed their armor, and traded stories of the worlds they had saved and the ones they had lost. There was laughter too, the kind that hides fear. Many of them knew they might not come back. But among Deathworlders, that wasn't a reason to hesitate. It was a reason to go harder. On the third night, as the last cargo ships finished loading supplies, Admiral Dern gave a speech broadcast across all ships. He stood before a window showing the endless black of space, his voice steady. "We do not know who they are," he said. "We do not know what waits for us. But we know one thing: someone asked for help. And we will answer. Because we are Deathworlders. We are the ones who don't look away." His words echoed through every deck, through every mind. Even those who had doubted now felt a fire in their chest. When the final countdown began, the space around Titan Dock glowed with energy. One by one, the massive engines of the fleet came alive, roaring like thunder across the void. The stars seemed to tremble. The ships formed into lines, a moving wall of power, each vessel carrying thousands of souls ready to face the unknown. The jump gates opened, releasing spirals of blue light that painted the darkness with color. As the Eternal Resolve led the way, Admiral Dern looked once more at the coordinates displayed on the screen. It was just a string of numbers, meaningless to most, but to him it represented life worth saving, even if it cost them everything. He gave the final order. "All ships, engage the drive. Let's bring them hope." And then, in a blinding flash of light, the Deathworlder fleet vanished into hyperspace, leaving behind the safety of their home. Ahead of them lay a mystery, a dying world, and a call that could not be ignored. For the first time in years, the galaxy would see what it truly meant when Deathworlders moved, not for conquest, not for revenge, but for compassion forged in fire. Somewhere far away on a broken world called Karun, a faint signal kept repeating into the void, not knowing that its call had been heard. The engines of the Deathworlder fleet came to life one by one, filling the darkness of space with a deep humming sound that could almost be felt in the bones. It was not just noise. It was the heartbeat of thousands of people preparing for something far greater than themselves. Across 10 different worlds, signals were being sent, ships were being awakened, and soldiers were being called back to duty. Every hangar was full of light and movement. Mechanics shouted orders, robots carried equipment, and engineers checked systems that had not been used in years. The Deathworlder fleet, silent for so long, was alive again. Inside the command center of the flagship Eternal Resolve, Admiral Cale Dern stood before a massive glass window that looked out into the stars. Below him, hundreds of officers were busy running calculations, plotting routes, and making sure every ship was ready for the long jump. The destination was unknown, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the reason. They were answering a cry for help. On the wall, the recorded SOS still played on repeat. The voice of the alien pleading for mercy was now burned into everyone's memory. It had become the heartbeat of the mission. The fleet's order of battle was large and diverse. Humans made up the core, experienced soldiers from Earth and Mars colonies trained to fight under impossible conditions. Alongside them were the Garun, tall, silver-skinned warriors who moved like water and whose ships were shaped like curved blades. The Veshek, known for their brutal strength, brought their heavily armored destroyers that could survive even a star's explosion. The O'Leary, a species of fragile but brilliant thinkers, provided the technology and the navigational systems that would guide them through uncharted space. Each species had its own reason for joining, but now they all shared one goal: reach Karun and save whoever was still alive. At the outer edge of Titan Dock, the ships began to form their positions. Huge carriers like the Iron Spire and Valiant Star took the lead. Behind them came the smaller escort vessels and medical ships. Fighters and bombers were loaded into launch bays, their pilots checking their controls again and again. Even though no one knew what kind of enemy they were going to face, the preparation was fierce. The Deathworlders always prepared for the worst. They had learned long ago that the universe was not kind. Life inside the ships was busy and tense. In the corridors of the Eternal Resolve, soldiers sat polishing their armor, laughing nervously to hide their fear. The sound of boots against the metal floor echoed everywhere. Some were writing messages to their families just in case they never came back. Others were telling stories of the old battles, reminding themselves that they had survived before. Every face carried a different emotion. Some looked determined, some afraid, and some strangely calm. They all knew what it meant to be a Deathworlder. It meant facing danger without waiting for someone else to go first. Among the younger recruits, rumors spread quickly. Some said that Karun was already gone, that there would be nothing left to save. Others whispered that the signal might be a trap, sent by enemies to lure the fleet into an ambush. But when these whispers reached Admiral Dern, he only said, "Then we'll see the truth with our own eyes." To him, even if there was a risk, it didn't matter. If there was even one chance that someone was still alive, he would take it. Far away, on the Veshek destroyer Howling Dawn, Commander Theric prepared his crew. He was a massive creature with skin like stone and eyes like molten iron. "We are not going there to die," he told his soldiers in a booming voice. "We are going there to show the galaxy that fear will never silence us." His crew roared in response, beating their chests, ready to fight for a cause they didn't even fully understand. But that was the strange beauty of the Deathworlders. They didn't need to understand. They only needed a reason to act. The preparation continued for days. Supply ships carried ammunition, food, and medical equipment between vessels. Technicians installed new communication relays so the fleet could stay connected, even across deep space. The Illyri engineers worked tirelessly, adjusting the hyperspace drives for long-distance travel. They knew that once the fleet jumped, there would be no going back until the mission was done. The unknown regions of space were unpredictable. Some areas were full of magnetic storms and black holes that could destroy a ship instantly, yet no one complained. The Deathworlders were built for uncertainty. On the second night, Admiral Dern met with his senior captains in the holographic war chamber. The lights dimmed as a 3D projection of the galaxy appeared before them, showing the route to Karun. "We'll be entering a region with no beacons," he said. "We'll have to navigate blind for half of the journey." One of the Garan captains frowned. "We've never gone that far, Admiral. If we lose formation, we might never find each other again." The Admiral nodded. "Then we don't lose formation. We stay together no matter what happens." His voice carried the kind of calm that came only from years of surviving chaos. As the meeting ended, silence filled the room. The captains understood what was being asked of them. They were not just fighting for their own worlds anymore. They were fighting for the idea that no one in the galaxy should ever be left alone to die. It was a simple idea, but powerful enough to unite warriors who once hated each other. When the final checklist was complete, Titan Dock looked like a small sun surrounded by ships. From the planet's surface, people could see the fleet glowing like a constellation. Children pointed at the sky, watching the lights move, unaware that those bright dots carried thousands of lives about to risk everything for strangers. It was a rare sight. So many ships from so many worlds standing side by side in peace. For once, the galaxy wasn't divided by fear, but united by courage. On the day of departure, the mood across the fleet was electric. Pilots strapped into their seats, technicians ran final diagnostics, and navigators took their positions. Every ship captain reported ready. The moment felt unreal. Some soldiers looked out of the windows at Titan's orange glow, taking a last look at home. Others closed their eyes and whispered quiet prayers. The countdown began, 10 seconds until hyperspace jump. The engines hummed louder, the air filled with static, and then Admiral Dern's voice echoed across every ship. "We move for Karun." With a burst of blinding light, the fleet jumped into hyperspace. Space folded and stretched around them. For a few seconds, everything went silent except for the low hum of energy. Stars became streaks of color, and time itself seemed to slow. To many of the younger soldiers, it felt like being swallowed by a dream. They were leaving behind the known galaxy and heading straight into the unknown. Inside the ships, life settled into routine. The journey would take several days, so soldiers trained, scientists monitored systems, and medics prepared for the wounded they expected to find. In the dining halls, people from different races shared food and stories. A human soldier taught a Garun officer how to play an old Earth card game. A Veshek warrior laughed for the first time in months, slamming his giant hand on the table and nearly breaking it. There was a strange sense of unity that made everyone forget their fears for a while. Admiral Dern spent most of his time on the bridge, watching the stars blur by. He thought about the voice from the SOS message. He wondered who that alien was. what they looked like, what they were feeling when they sent that desperate call. He didn't even know if they were still alive, but something inside him refused to give up hope. They called us because they believed someone would come, he said quietly to himself. We'll prove them right. Then suddenly on the fourth day, alarms rang across the fleet. One of the scouts had detected strange energy readings ahead, signs of massive destruction. The bridge lights flashed red, and everyone rushed to their positions. The Eternal Resolve dropped out of hyperspace first, followed by the rest of the fleet. The view that appeared before them made every heart freeze. A planet hung in the distance, half covered in smoke and fire. It was Karun. Even from space they could see the scars, the cities burning, the surface torn apart. Debris floated in orbit, broken satellites and shattered ships. The SOS signal was still coming from the planet, weak but alive. Someone down there was still fighting. For a moment, the entire fleet went silent. Then Admiral Dern spoke, his voice steady and strong. We found them, he said. All ships, prepare for combat entry. The soldiers cheered, the engines roared louder, and the Deathworlders, the fiercest warriors of the galaxy, set their course for the burning world below. They didn't know what kind of enemy they were about to face, but one thing was certain. The Deathworlders had answered the call, and nothing in the universe could stop them now. When the Deathworlder fleet dropped out of hyperspace, silence filled every ship. Before them hung the planet Karun, spinning slowly under a blanket of black smoke. The once green world looked wounded. From orbit they could see oceans boiling, continents glowing red with fire, and the last remaining cities flickering like dying candles. Every screen on the command deck showed the same terrible sight. The planet was alive, but only barely. The SOS signal they had followed was still there, repeating weakly, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. Admiral Cale Dern stood at the front of the bridge, his eyes locked on the burning planet. Around him, officers shouted data reports. Energy signatures detected. Massive heat pockets across the northern hemisphere. Another voice added, Sir, there are ships in orbit. No, not ships. Something else. The sensors struggled to read what they were seeing. Floating above Karun was a swarm of dark shapes, millions of them, moving like insects. They were not organized in any pattern, just a mass of living metal. When the Deathworlders tried to scan them, the signals bounced back, scrambled, and distorted. Dern's second-in-command, the Garoon officer Lisun, narrowed her silver eyes. They're feeding, she said softly. They're feeding on the planet. She was right. The swarm was consuming everything. Metal, oxygen, organic matter, even energy from the planet's magnetic field. Whatever these creatures were, they were not an army in the normal sense. They were a plague. The fleet's comms officer whispered, If we don't stop them, Karun will be gone in hours. The admiral gave his first order. All ships battle formation. Protect the planet. At once, the Deathworlder fleet moved into position. The great carriers spread their wings, releasing fighter squadrons that filled space like shining sparks. Destroyers armed their railguns and plasma cannons. Medical ships stayed behind, ready for the wounded. There was no more doubt, no hesitation. The fleet had come to fight. As the Deathworlders approached, the swarm noticed them. The dark shapes turned, moving with terrifying speed. They came like a black wave stretching across the void. The first contact came without warning. A Veshek destroyer, the Iron Spire, was struck by hundreds of the biomechanical creatures at once. They latched onto its hull, tearing through armor with claws of living steel. Inside, alarms screamed. The crew fought desperately, firing internal turrets and electrifying the ship's surface. They're inside the hull, shouted the captain before the transmission cut off. Seconds later, the Iron Spire exploded, scattering metal and flame through the dark. The fleet responded instantly. Fighters launched missiles into the swarm, the explosions lighting up the sky like fireworks. But for every creature destroyed, more appeared. They didn't die easily. When one was torn apart, its fragments reformed into smaller versions of itself. They multiply, said Lisun, her voice tight. They eat and grow. Admiral Dern clenched his fists. Then we starve them. He gave a new command. Concentrate fire on the central mass. Cut off their energy flow. The fleet obeyed. Human battleships moved to the front lines, forming a shield wall of plasma fire. The Garan cruisers sliced through the swarm with precision beams, while Veshek heavy guns blasted the larger clusters into dust. The O'Leary ships, small but agile, projected powerful EMP waves that disrupted the creatures' coordination. Slowly, the tide began to shift. In orbit above the southern hemisphere, a group of pilots led by Commander Hale flew straight into the heart of the swarm. Their ships spun and dodged like arrows of light, firing continuously. "Stay close, don't break formation," Hale shouted over comms. One by one, his squadron picked off enemies, cutting a path through the chaos. But then the swarm adapted. The creatures began firing back, spitting streams of plasma energy from their bodies. A bolt hit Hale's wingman and his ship vanished in an instant. "We've got more coming," another pilot cried. Hale gritted his teeth and pushed forward. "We hold this line. No one gets past us." Down below, on the planet's surface, the Karunians, who had survived the invasion, saw streaks of light cutting through the clouds. They looked up from the ruins of their cities and realized they were not alone anymore. Strange ships fought above their sky, fighting for them. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered among them. One of the survivors, a scientist named Riak, climbed to the top of a shattered tower and watched the battle with trembling hands. "They came," he whispered, tears burning his eyes. "Someone heard us." Back in orbit, the battle raged on. Hours passed. Space was filled with debris, fire, and silence broken only by the sounds of destruction. The Deathworlders fought with everything they had. The Veshek ships rammed into the densest parts of the swarm, sacrificing themselves to open holes in the enemy lines. Human marines and drop pods launched from carriers, crashing through the atmosphere to reach the ground and protect survivors. Karun strike teams used boarding pods to attach to the larger swarm creatures, cutting them apart from the inside. Every move was costly, but none of them backed down. At one point, the fleet's communication lines went dead. The swarm had released a pulse of interference that knocked out all signals. Each ship was suddenly alone, fighting blind. The silence was suffocating. Inside the Eternal Resolve, the lights flickered and systems failed one by one. Admiral Dern looked around the darkened bridge. "Manual control," he said calmly. "We've been through worse." They rerouted power, bringing weapons back online. The Admiral ordered the ship to dive straight into the center of the swarm. The crew gasped, but they obeyed. The Eternal Resolve roared forward, its cannons blazing, tearing through the creatures. The view outside was pure madness. Thousands of mechanical horrors swarming over the hull, claws scraping against metal, sparks flying. The ship's shields flared bright, threatening to collapse. "Hull integrity at 40%, shouted an officer. "Hold it together," Dern barked. Suddenly, Lisan noticed something. In the center of the swarm, far above the planet, was a larger shape, a glowing sphere pulsing with red light. "That's the core," she said. "That's what's controlling them." Dern didn't hesitate. "All ships target that core." "Bring it down!" The fleet regrouped. The human and Garun ships cleared a path while Veshek destroyers powered up their heaviest cannons. The Illyri ships transmitted data to guide their shots. Firing in 3, 2, 1. The space around Karun lit up brighter than a sun as the combined firepower struck the core. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the red light began to crack. A shrill sound filled every radio channel, like the scream of a dying machine. The core exploded in a blinding wave that spread through the swarm, tearing it apart. The creatures fell silent. One by one, they stopped moving, their bodies drifting lifelessly through space. The few that remained scattered and vanished into the void. On the planet below, the skies began to clear for the first time in weeks. The firestorms died down and the ash started to settle. The Deathworlder fleet hung in orbit, broken and smoking. Many ships were gone, reduced to fragments drifting among the wreckage. The Iron Spire, Howling Dawn, and several smaller vessels had been lost completely. Thousands of lives had been given to save one world, but the mission was not over. Admiral Dern ordered landing parties to descend. "Get down there," he said. "Find the ones who called for us." When the dropships touched down, the soldiers stepped into a world of ruin. Buildings lay in pieces and the air was thick with the smell of burned metal. But among the wreckage they found survivors. The Karunians, weak and afraid, stared at the strange armored figures stepping out of the mist. One of the humans removed his helmet and smiled gently. "It's okay," he said. "You're safe now." The Karunians couldn't understand his words, but they understood his tone. They reached out with shaking hands. The Deathworlders lifted them, gave them water, food, and light. Above them, the fleet began to repair itself. Fires were still burning on some ships, but there was laughter in the comms again. The battle was over. That night, from the surface of Karun, the survivors watched the Deathworlder fleet shining in the sky like a constellation of hope. They didn't know who these saviors were or where they came from, but they would never forget the day the stars themselves answered their cry for help. Admiral Dern stood on the bridge staring down at the quiet planet. The cost had been unbearable, but as he looked at the small green dots of life returning to Karun's surface, he knew it had been worth it. "We did it," Leeson said softly beside him. Dern nodded, his voice low. "We kept our promise." The fleet had answered the call, and though they had paid with blood and metal, they had proven once again what made Deathworlders different. They didn't run from the darkness, they flew straight into it. The battle for Karun was over, but the silence that followed was heavier than the war itself. The sky above the planet had cleared, but it was not blue. It was gray and full of drifting smoke. The Deathworlder fleet floated quietly in orbit, half of it broken and scarred. Many of the ships that had once glowed like stars were now cold and dark, their lights gone forever. The survivors on each vessel moved slowly, their faces showing a strange mix of relief and grief. They had won, yes, but the price of victory was written in every ruined ship and every name missing from the comm logs. Admiral Cale Dern stood alone in the command deck of the Eternal Resolve, staring out at the wreckage. Around him, the bridge was quiet except for the soft beeping of damaged systems. A medic entered quietly and placed a list on his console, names of those confirmed lost. Dern didn't read it at first. He simply stared at the paper as if holding it might change the truth. When he finally looked down, his jaw tightened. Dozens of names. Officers, pilots, engineers, soldiers, people who had trusted him. People who would never go home again. He folded the paper and placed it in his pocket, his eyes still fixed on the wounded world below. Down on Karun's surface, the Deathworlder ground teams worked tirelessly to find survivors. The planet was a graveyard, buildings reduced to ash, rivers poisoned, and air filled with dust. Yet among the ruins there were signs of life. The Karunians, fragile and translucent, had hidden in underground chambers. When the first human soldier opened a bunker door, a beam of sunlight cut through the darkness, and the small creatures flinched away, thinking the invaders had returned. But when they saw the soldiers holding out water and food instead of weapons, their fear turned into disbelief. The rescuers spoke in different tongues, but kindness needed no translation. Over the next few days, more survivors were found. Medical teams set up tents and engineers built shelters using wreckage from fallen ships. Doctors from Earth and the Garun treated the wounded, using what little supplies they had left. Many of the soldiers gave away their own rations to feed the Karunians. For the first time since the war began, there were smiles. Weak, uncertain smiles, but real ones. The Deathworlders had come as warriors, but now they had become saviors. One evening, a group of Karun children gathered near the human camp. They watched the soldiers fixing their ships and patching their armor. One child, small and glowing faintly under the dim light, walked up to a soldier sitting near a fire. The soldier smiled and offered a piece of dried fruit. The child took it, sniffed it carefully, and then laughed for the first time in months. The sound spread through the camp, soft and hopeful. Even the soldiers who had lost everything couldn't help but smile. That tiny laugh reminded them why they had come all this way. But not everything was peaceful. Inside the fleet, pain and loss filled every corridor. Funerals were held aboard the surviving ships. In the cold vacuum of space, small capsules containing the bodies of fallen soldiers were released, drifting slowly toward the stars. The sound of the memorial bells echoed through the ships, low and haunting. On the Howling Dawn's sister ship, the Silver Veil, the Veshek commander stood before his crew and said, "They did not die for victory. They died for meaning. Remember that." His deep voice trembled, but his eyes stayed fierce. Admiral Dern attended every ceremony he could. Each time he placed his hand over his chest and bowed his head as the capsules disappeared into the darkness. When asked if he regretted coming to Karun, he only said, "No. I regret that we couldn't save more." Those words spread across the fleet, reminding everyone why they had fought. On the planet, the survivors began to tell their stories. The Karunians explained that the swarm had come from beyond their star system, machines that devoured energy and life wherever they went. They had tried to fight back, but their weapons were too weak. When the cities started to fall, they sent the SOS signal in desperation, not even knowing if anyone could hear them. "We didn't believe anyone would come," said Riak, the scientist who had sent the final transmission. "But you came. You saved us." His voice broke as he spoke. The translator softly repeated his words in human language. and the soldiers around him fell silent. Over time, the Deathworlders and the Karunians worked side by side to rebuild what little could be saved. The planet's soil was burnt, its air still heavy with toxins, but life was returning slowly. The Garan used their bioengineering knowledge to purify the water. Human engineers repaired the communication systems, so the Karunians could contact the wider galaxy for help. Every day brought new challenges, but also small victories. A new well dug, a generator restarted, a group of children playing among the ruins. These moments mattered more than any medal. At night, the soldiers gathered around fires and looked up at the sky. The stars seemed brighter now, as if the universe itself was watching. They spoke quietly about those who had fallen. Stories were told about heroes who had sacrificed themselves to hold the line, about pilots who had rammed their ships into the swarm to save others. Each tale added to the legend of the fleet. The Deathworlders were known across the galaxy for their strength, but now they would also be remembered for their compassion. Despite the rebuilding, not everyone could find peace. Some soldiers struggled with guilt. "We came too late," one said to Admiral Dern during a supply check. "Half the planet is gone." The Admiral looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Maybe, but half still lives because we came. That's enough." His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the weight he carried inside. Weeks passed. The fleet repaired what it could. Ships with damaged engines were stripped for parts to fix others. The Eternal Resolve became a temporary command hub and hospital. The Karunians began calling the Deathworlders the Sky Guardians, a name that spread quickly among their people. They painted it on the walls of the surviving buildings, a symbol of gratitude that glowed faintly at night. Some of the soldiers found comfort in this simple word. After all the blood and fire, being called a guardian felt right. One day, while inspecting the ruins near the equator, Admiral Dern found a broken communication tower. It was the one that had sent the original SOS message. He stood there for a long time, imagining the fear of the person who had pressed the button, not knowing if anyone would hear. Then he placed his hand on the metal frame and whispered, "We heard you." He didn't realize that one of the Karun children was nearby, watching him. The child didn't understand his words but could feel the emotion behind them. The child smiled and touched the Admiral's arm gently before running back to the village. That simple gesture stayed with him longer than any medal or ceremony. Eventually, the time came for the fleet to leave. The Karun government, though weak and shaken, had begun to rebuild. Other galactic aid ships were arriving now that the danger was gone. The Deathworlders had done what they came for. As the ships prepared for departure, the Karunians gathered on the surface to watch them. They waved glowing lights toward the sky as the engines began to ignite. The Admiral stood on the bridge watching through the viewport. "We came as soldiers," he said softly, "but we leave as friends." As the fleet began to ascend, a signal came from the surface, Riak, the scientist, sending one last message. "To the ones who came from the stars," his voice said through the comms, "you gave us back our world. We will never forget." The words were simple, but they carried across every ship, echoing in the hearts of all who heard them. When the Deathworlder fleet broke orbit and moved into open space, the sight behind them was beautiful. Karun, though scarred and broken, was shining again under the sunlight. The smoke had thinned, and small patches of green were visible where life had begun to return. The Admiral smiled faintly. "She'll live," he whispered. But not everything could be forgotten. The cost of that life, the ships lost, the friends gone, the pain endured, would remain forever. Yet for the Deathworlders, that was part of who they were. They didn't fear loss. They accepted it as the price of doing what was right. They were not heroes for glory or fame. They were heroes because they refused to stand by and watch the innocent fall. As the fleet turned toward the next star, silence filled the bridge once more. Listen approached and said, "Admiral, do you think they'll remember us?" He looked out at the fading planet and replied, "Maybe not all of them, but somewhere someone will tell the story, and that's enough." The Eternal Resolve moved forward, leading the fleet into the endless black. Behind them, Karun slowly healed, carrying the memory of the day when strangers from the most dangerous worlds became its protectors. And as the Deathworlder fleet vanished into the horizon of space, every surviving soul on Karun looked up at the stars and whispered the same silent promise. They would never forget those who came from the fire to save them. Months had passed since the Deathworlder fleet left Karun. The planet was healing slowly, but the scars of war still covered its surface. Forests had begun to grow again in places where fire once ruled, and the air, though still heavy with dust, carried the sound of life once more. The Karunians were rebuilding their cities with the help of the technology left behind by the fleet. They had learned from the humans and other Deathworlders how to strengthen their structures, how to purify water, and even how to protect themselves in the future. But most importantly, they had learned courage, a strange, powerful thing that the Deathworlders had shown them through action, not words. In the far reaches of space, the Eternal Resolve and the rest of the fleet traveled through the silent void. Their next destination was unknown. They had answered one SOS, but there were always more cries in the universe. Still, the battle for Karun had left deep marks on everyone. The soldiers who survived carried invisible wounds, memories of fire, screams, and faces they would never see again. Yet there was also pride in their hearts. They had saved a world that wasn't theirs, and in doing so, they had proven that even in a galaxy full of fear, there was still hope. Admiral Cale Dern sat alone in his cabin one night, staring at a small holographic image projected from his wrist device. It showed the Karun children laughing beside the soldiers, holding up small glowing stones as a sign of friendship. The Admiral had received the image as a message of thanks from Riak, the Karun scientist. "Your people are now part of our history," Riak's voice had said. "When our children ask who saved us, we will speak your names." Dern replayed those words again and again. For a man who had spent most of his life fighting endless wars, this one message felt like the first true victory he had ever known. In the fleet's common hall, soldiers gathered every evening to share stories. The atmosphere was quieter than before the war. Some laughed softly. Others simply listened. They spoke not of battles, but of moments. Of a Karun child who had offered a soldier a piece of glowing fruit. Of a Veshek pilot who refused to abandon her wingmate even when her ship was burning. Of a human medic who had walked through fire to carry a wounded alien to safety. These stories became their comfort, something pure in a life built around chaos. Lieutenant Lisan had started keeping a small digital journal. He recorded every detail of their mission, not as an officer's report but as a personal promise to remember. Sometimes he would sit by the observation deck, typing slowly while watching the stars drift past. "We went to save them," he once wrote. "But maybe they saved us too. They reminded us why we fight, not for orders or pride, but for the simple truth that life is precious." He never shared those words with anyone, but somehow they captured what every soldier felt deep inside. One day, as the fleet traveled through a quiet sector of space, the long-range sensors picked up a faint signal. It wasn't an SOS this time, it was a message from Karun. The signal was weak but clear enough to decode. The message showed a group of Karunians standing under a newly built monument. The monument was carved from the metal remains of fallen ships, shaped like a rising flame. At its base were the names of the Deathworlder ships and crew who had died defending them. The Karun leader appeared in the transmission and said, "To the Sky Guardians, our stars will carry your names forever." The entire fleet watched in silence as the message ended. No one spoke for a long time. Then softly someone began to clap. One by one the others joined, their hands echoing through the ship like a heartbeat. The monument became a symbol, not just for the Karunians but for every world that heard the story. The tale of the Deathworlder fleet spread through the galaxy, how warriors from the harshest planets had crossed light years to save a gentle race on the edge of extinction. Many called it the miracle of Karun, others called it the day the fire saved the light. To some, it was just another battle in the long history of space, but to those who had lived it, it was a story of unity, courage, and the strange, stubborn kindness of those who refused to ignore a cry for help. But not everyone in the fleet found peace. Some couldn't sleep at night. The sounds of the swarm, the cries of dying friends still haunted them. One soldier, Sergeant Vega, spent his days working alone in the hangar, fixing broken drones. When asked why, he said quietly, "If I keep fixing things, maybe I can fix myself too." The others understood. Each of them carried their own way of coping. Some found comfort in work, others in silence. Yet through all the pain, there was a quiet pride that kept them standing. They had faced something impossible and survived. Admiral Dern made sure every family of the fallen received a message. He didn't let the communication officers handle it. He wrote each one himself, line by line, even when it took him all night. His messages were simple. Your loved one saved lives that will never forget their name. When the messages were sent, he finally allowed himself to rest for a few hours. But in his dreams, he was back on Karun, walking through ash and light, hearing the laughter of the children again. Months later, the fleet finally received new orders. A distant colony had gone silent, and once again the Deathworlders were being called. The moment the command came through, the entire fleet came alive. Systems powered up, engines hummed, and lights filled the decks. Despite their exhaustion, everyone moved with purpose. This was who they were. Wherever someone cried for help, they would go. Not because of duty alone, but because it was in their nature to protect. As the ships prepared to jump, Leeson stood beside the Admiral on the bridge. "It never ends, does it?" he asked softly. The Admiral gave a faint smile. "No," he said, "and that's why we keep going." The jump countdown began. The stars outside started to stretch and blur as the fleet aligned for warp. "Karun taught us something," Dern added. "Even the smallest voice in the dark deserves an answer." Leeson nodded, understanding the weight behind the words. When the countdown reached 0, the Deathworlder fleet vanished into the glowing rift of hyperspace, leaving behind a trail of light. Somewhere far away, the monument on Karun stood under a clear sky. The wind blew softly through the ruins, carrying with it the faint hum of the stars. The Karun children would often gather near the monument at night, pointing up at the constellations. "That one," they would say, "that's where the Sky Guardians live." Their teachers would smile and tell them stories of humans, Karun, Veshek, and others who came from dangerous worlds but fought not for power, only for hope. Years later, when Karun had fully recovered, the Deathworlder fleet still roamed the galaxy. They had seen countless worlds, faced countless dangers, but the story of Karun remained special. New recruits in the fleet would hear about it during their training. It became a part of their legacy, a reminder of who they were meant to be. Some of the veterans even returned to Karun years later, their ships landing quietly among the rebuilt cities. The Karunians welcomed them like family. Flowers and glowing stones were laid at the monument's base, and music filled the air. It was not a song of mourning, but of life. Admiral Dern, older now and carrying a cane from an old injury, stood in front of the monument. He placed his hand on the engraved names and whispered, "You did well." Around him, laughter and music mixed with the rustling wind. He looked up at the sky, the same sky where his fleet had once vanished into war, and smiled. "We kept our promise," he said quietly. "We answered." That night, as darkness covered Karun, the stars above shimmered brightly. Somewhere out there, the Deathworlder fleet was still on the move, answering new cries for help, bringing light where there was darkness. And on Karun, in every child's heart, the legend of the Sky Guardians lived on. Not as warriors of destruction, but as protectors of life. The story of Karun became more than history. It became a symbol for every living being who dared to hope. It reminded the galaxy that even those born in the harshest worlds could carry the gentlest hearts. The Deathworlders were proof that courage was not about being fearless. It was about facing the fear and still choosing to do what was right. And so, the fleet kept moving through the endless night, guided not by orders, but by something far stronger, a promise made under a burning sky to never ignore a cry for help again. Wherever that cry came from, no matter how far, the Deathworlders would come. Because that was who they were. That was what made them human.